I'm going to start off with a Gamakatsu SP11 3L3H. This is a 2/0. For the tail, this is how we're going to set the length of this fly. So I'm going to go with the top portion of the bucktail just because it doesn't flare quite as bad as everything else. And you can tell this has like pretty long tip fibers, so that'll help us get a longer tail, better taper, stuff like that. Clear out the under fur. And if you haven't seen my bucktail tips video, I like to twist it in my fingers and then brush that out a little bit. So what this does is it gets everything not laying in the same direction. If you have a turn or something in your bucktail, it just kind of twists all the fibers and gets them more in line. So if you do get bucktail that flares too much, you can use really light, like with no pressure at all, wraps of thread just to kind of tame it a little bit. But this was really good for me, so I don't have to do much of that. So now we're going to use Flashabou and Polar Flash. Paul's from overseas. England, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Don't quote me on that. But what you see from a lot of overseas tires is a lot of mixing of materials. And you think two different types of flashes. Well, you mix both of them together and you get the best of both worlds in a mix. I love this stuff. So I love doing this stuff. And again, to mix this, I'm gonna twist it in my fingers and then give it a comb. Definitely doesn't have to be perfect. Now we need to make sure we have a taper on it. We're gonna taper these ends just a little bit. Just like that. So we're going to go a little bit past the bucktail. Couple loose wraps. And I'm going to smash this to kind of help it go around the hook. Okay. So to help this taper a little bit more, this is something I do. I'm going to come down the hook with my thread. And then back. And I'm gonna fold all this stuff to the underneath side of the hook and force it back to the tail and give it a wrap here, and then I can flip this over and know that everything's gonna be covered that I want covered. Because you want this to kind of envelop the tail. So now we're gonna go with some more bucktail. This stuff we do want to flare. We don't want it to flare a whole bunch. We're gonna use that middle ground. I really suggest, if you haven't seen it, to go watch my bucktail video, my bucktail tying tips video. I'll link it in the description of this video. It should help you a lot. But we don't want super flary bucktail, but we want it to flare a little bit because this is gonna be the bulk of the fly, pretty much. This is where our taper is really going to start to build toward the head. And we're going to reverse tie this. A couple of loose wraps. And then force it around the hook. Once you like it, bind it down. Heavy, heavy thread wraps. I'm going to trim these butt ends. But you have to have this hump here. Have to have this. Trust me, don't cut these off flat. If you do, your thread will slip over it and everybody's seen it. You don't want that. So the best way to judge this is you kind of want these fibers to be about halfway down your tail, right? So you can see how they fall in line with the tail. They're not as long as the tail because we don't want them to be. Same process. Work these fibers around the hook. Bind the top down. Fold the fibers underneath. Work them around the hook. And bind them down. So now we're going to use two different colors of bucktail, white and yellow, or olive and yellow, or however you want to do, whatever color system you're doing. A little tip, I'm always going to start by tying in the bucktail on the bottom. It'll make sense in just a second. Going for that middle-ish section, depending on the bucktail. All bucktails are a little different, but you know, typically that middle section is what flares a little bit, gives you a good flare. We're going to tie this in underneath, reverse style. Same thing for the yellow. The reason I tie the bottom on first is because we want to cover the whole way around the hook, but we need more of the top color than we do the bottom color. So we want the top color to kind of envelop around the bottom color a little bit. Okay. A couple light wraps, and then we push down on it a little bit. We don't want it to go all the way around the hook. We just want it to kind of make it to where it's just around the bottom color, and then flare it. Same process again. So we need to go pretty short this time compared to the other times, or we'll bleed too much into different zones. Give it a good taper. So now we're going with Naiad. We're going to have the yellow on top, the white on bottom, but we're also going to mix white Angelina fibers into the white and these green Angelina fibers into the yellow. So again, for the same reason, I'm going to tie the bottom on first. I'm going to do the white first. And we don't want this to be super long at all. So we're going to mix these by just pulling and stacking and pulling, just like you've seen over the last few videos. Flip it over, do the same thing. Once I get it there, I'm going to give it a good brush. We're going to tie this in on the bottom 50-50. See the gap here? We want these fibers to cover the gap. So we're going to force these fibers to go where we want them to. Flat tying is basically manipulating materials for it to do what you want it to do. So we're all covered. I'm going to bind that down really hard and make one more wrap. Now we're going to fold these fibers back. We're going to go white first. We're going to smash this around the hook with our thumb, bind it down, and the same thing on top. And we'll finish. So I have been waiting to use these eyes. Deadmeatcustoms, just a blackout eye. It's so cool. So we're gonna go with Lumen UV Thick, and we're just gonna fill these gaps. To totally seal these eyes off, I've gotten to the point where I use UV thin and I brush it on instead of like using the little needles and stuff like that and just squeezing it out. Typically it does better for me. Super thin coat over the whole eye and all of the resin that we just put on. Also, this step gets rid of that little spot on the eye where I glued myself to it. If you have any bubbles or anything, hit it with a lighter and it'll get rid of the bubbles. And then cure it. And if you have 2 plasma lights, you can really get after it. And you have the finished flashy Deceiver.